So should I, so for the room.
I'll plug this. I'll put this back. You don't want to hold this, right? You want to.
Yeah. Okay. I think everything is set up.
All right, everyone. Good morning. How's everybody today? Welcome to day 4 of the NYU Artificial Intelligence Forum. We appreciate that everyone's here today on a Thursday morning, right before a Labor Day weekend. Thank you for coming out. You're in for a treat today, a big, big treat, actually. Before we get going, I think Liz has a few words.
I just wanted to check in with everybody. How's everybody feeling about what you're learning? Good? Yeah, today's going to be an amazing day. I'm so happy you're here. I don't know what else to say. I mean, it's going to be amazing what you're going to learn and walk out of here today. That's going to change your lives.
I think so too. Just to go backwards, sometimes it's helpful, I think, to look back and reflect on our guests and the speakers. Is there anything for those of you who were here yesterday or day 2 or day 1 that comes to mind that you'd like to address? Any questions, concerns, comments? No? Well, it's great that you're saying that you can't stop thinking about Midjourney, because our guest today is going to literally transform your mindset as it relates to the immediate gratification of creating a product and an ad campaign, and then thinking about how that can translate to impacting your target customer or your target audience. So it's going to take it to the next level. Hopefully you'll see that and you'll agree.
One other thing I want to share with you, I heard last night that NYU is going to provide Chat GPT to all its students in the next week or so. Just FYI.
All right. All right. So let's get started today. We're going to take a little bit of a different approach with today because it really is a special presentation. Mr. Camilo Fosco is here today. He is the founder and chief technology officer of Memorable AI. Camilo graduated with an MS and DS from Harvard and also has a PhD from MIT. He's a Fulbright scholar. He's impressively a leading researcher in computer vision for Google, for Meta, and NVIDIA. And with Memorable AI, although it's a new concept, which you'll see, he already has some of the most impressive clients as it relates to media buying on the planet, including multinational corporations like Procter & Gamble, Unilever, L'Oreal, Bayer, and Diageo. So as I mentioned yesterday, Camilo was kind enough to come in from Boston for today. The format is going to be a little bit different. Camilo is going to join us on stage. I think it's really important for you to fully understand the power and the concept of memorability and how AI is going to completely revolutionize the way advertisers and other companies communicate with consumers. And Camilo really is at the forefront of that. So he's going to present for about 20, 30 minutes. We're going to get a little bit deep into tech and into psychology and into fine art. And then he's going to join me on stage and we're going to break it down a little further. So please welcome our guest today, Camilo Fosco.
Hi, everyone. Thanks a lot for having me here. It's amazing to be here in New York. I love the city and NYU is so cool. So thanks for having me. All right, so today we're going to talk a little bit about memorable first. What do we do? How we're kind of using AI to improve advertising and mostly give tools to marketers to improve creative effectiveness. And then I'm going to go a little bit into the research that is connected to the main pillars that were memorable, to get a little bit more on the research side, talk about one of the kind of interesting dimensions related to all of this that hopefully will be useful and interesting for everyone. All right, so we'll start very quickly talking a little bit about memorable. First, what is memorable? What we're trying to build essentially is an AI creative copilot for marketing effectiveness. It's a copilot that helps the marketer in three main ways. One of them is to analyze their past history, understand what worked and what didn't work in the past. The other one is to predict, given new assets, new creatives, what can you predict from them to know if they will perform or not? And the last one is generate. So essentially, once you have all of this information, then you use all of that to create new assets that are better. So we work with big clients, as Mark said, and we started about 2 years ago. And so far, well, we've been kind of on a growth trajectory and it has been super exciting. So let me tell you a little bit why we focus on this. One of the key concepts that are important to understand here is that although the marketing industry is very data-driven and focuses on kind of trying to improve its performance in different areas, there's one area that is extremely strong in its actual contribution to sales lift, and that is usually disregarded, which is creative. People spend a lot of time looking at targeting, looking at reach, but not that many people really know what creatives work and what creatives don't work and how to improve them. And in fact, when we started diving into this, we realized that lots of marketers nowadays are guided by intuition and by guesswork a lot. If you enter in agencies, there's a lot of this idea of the very nice creative work and I'm gonna make something that looks nice and I think it's this way. And sometimes it works, sometimes it really doesn't. And to us, it was pretty surprising that people are not taking a purely strong data-driven approach to understanding what creative works and what doesn't. Right? Just look at the data and try to make predictions. This problem is particularly important when you look at things like this, where you have these two ads, right? And they look pretty cool. Both of them look, I don't know, potentially similar. They definitely have kind of different pacing, different concepts. And it's hard to tell really which one will perform better, right? In fact, why don't we do this show of hands? Who thinks the asset on your right is better performing than the asset on your left? Let's see, raise hands. Oh, we have maybe one hand over there. 2, nice, 3. Sorry? Yeah, definitely an interesting concept. There are some general, very strong patterns that you can measure, but yeah. Interesting, interesting. No use of mayonnaise. All right, those are some good concepts. Yes. It's a good concept. There are definitely some variations according to audiences. But one thing that is quite strong is that you can actually look at performance over multiple audiences and get general patterns. And one thing that we saw directly is that Hellman's was showing these two assets to pretty much the same audiences. This was a general audience in the US, if I'm not mistaken. Ages reasonably adulty. And what they found is that the asset on the right is actually 7 times more costly than the asset on the left. So you're paying 7 times more per click for the asset on the right than the asset on the left in this target audience. So this is, for me, super surprising, right? There's one asset that is really massively more expensive than the other. The other is generally better performing. And marketers are generally not pretty good at predicting what will work, right? People are generally not remembering a certain assets. And when you actually test people as to whether they're able to detect if an asset is going to perform better than another, be it on CTR, on CPC, or other metrics, they're generally not better than average. It's very close to flipping a coin. So essentially, bad creative is expensive. And it turns out that it's really everywhere. You need a strong solution to be able to understand if a creative will perform or not, to avoid the situation where you're posting something that looks really reasonable and it ends up costing 7 times more than another alternative. So that's one of the things that we try to optimize for. Memorable is essentially trying to maximize kind of visual marketing effectiveness by using predictive models. So we understand what worked in your previous campaigns. We predict what will work with specific models that learn from those and large databases of human responses. And we can create and alter ads and test new concepts quickly. And as you can see in this animation, kind of the general concept of what we do is you give us an ad, we detect a bunch of things on it, we understand the performance of that ad over multiple metrics, and then we essentially showcase recommendations and potential changes that will increase or impact some of the important metrics. We can apply those. The general idea here is that there are people that are kind of trying to do that already. They're doing A/B tests kind of at the end. They're trying to modify the asset or kind of get the insights from previous campaigns to try to modify those. But generally, the legacy solutions are usually slow. They test at the end and they come quite late, right? When the asset is potentially already in flight or gathering insights that you can only use on your next campaign. What we try to do is help all along the process. When you're first starting with the creative concepts, with our insights from your history, and then while you're iterating on a new asset by applying changes that make it better over time. This is essentially powered by our AI models that allow you to improve that model as it goes on, that asset. So I won't bore you with the details, but essentially our product gives you things like impact scores, auto recommendations. It tells you what is similar and better from your competitors. It measures things in context. It allows you to really optimize all stages. Today, I'm going to talk a little bit about essentially the tech that powers this, that allows for all of this, and a little bit of the research related to this. So we have kind of 3 main pillars. One of them is scene parsing and understanding. One thing that you need to do if you want to ensure that you can understand these assets is first, given an image, given a video, understand what's in it, right? Be able to detect the different elements that are in it, be able to classify that image to know if it's more of an outdoor scene, indoor scene, things like that, right? And that's kind of table stakes computer vision. The second pillar is cognitive impact modeling. Once you understand what works, what objects are present in an image, you're still without that dimension of knowing whether it's going to have a certain specific cognitive impact on people. And by cognitive impact, I mean an impact that's more related to metrics typically measured in cognitive science, things like attention, things like memory, things like emotion, etc. So we have models that can predict metrics connected to those, which are typically hard to predict and mostly overlooked by marketers today. And finally, our last pillar is generative modeling. So we use generative models both to help people create assets, to create people alter assets. And now we're soon bringing a way for people to chat with our platform and essentially apply all the modifications and predictions to a chat interface. So in scene parsing and understanding, that's quite straightforward. Try to tag as much as you can from a given asset, right? So essentially tag different objects that appear, tag the presence of the logo, where it pops up, product presence, colors, brightness, etc. Whether there's a celebrity or not, extract all the text, etc. The second key pillar is cognitive metrics. So, okay, you understand what's in an image. Now, can you actually tell me whether people will remember it? We're a little bit more in depth in that, but there's actually very cool patterns that show that humans are generally consistent in what images or what videos they tend to remember and what images and videos they tend to forget. And you can predict part of that impact really, really well. So one of the big things that we focus on is essentially building models that can predict ad recall, whether someone will remember or not after seeing it once. Things like attention, whether people will look at it in a certain context. Things like distinctiveness, give me your competitors, am I distinctive or not? And other things like aesthetics, do people generally think that it will look good? Things like that. To do this specifically, well, generally you do some classic machine learning work where you build models that can essentially, given an image, predict a certain score, and you train those models with lots and lots of data. In our case, we use essentially two big sources of data. One of them are cognitive experiments that we apply at scale. I'm going to go a little bit more in depth about this, but essentially we have these small games that are running in different places that allow people to essentially test their memory on assets or test their attention on different assets. We gather all that data and we use that to train models. And then we, of course, use ad manager data from our clients. Our client integrates with us, get their ad manager data, and from that we can train specific models that work for their type of data and their audiences. We have kind of very big databases of cognitive data and ad manager data. Now it's even more than 13 million. I don't know the latest number. And with that, we get kind of the best performing models in the industry today, specifically for predicting these cognitive metrics. We're super accurate in saliency or attention predictions. We have the lowest error memorability. And we're really good at essentially given two elements, choosing the right one according to these different metrics. So a model can tell you like, well, if you're choosing between these two, it's the one on the right. For generative, the generative explosion has been super, super interesting for us because we've been able to leverage some of these models to essentially kind of plug them into our pipeline and generate this very nice step-by-step process where you can generate something and then immediately score it and then apply modifications and see how that score improves or decreases your performance. That guided by recommendations. So we have some really nice tools integrated and a cool demo that you can all check out. If you go to admaker.memorable.io, that allows you to generate some images and see what our scores say about that image and then modify them in any way you see fit. So, we can do like small things like this, modify an image and see how ad recall improves or decreases as you make modifications. Not only that, you can alter specific things about it. So, the classic stuff that has been popping up all over the place, powered by some of these really, really nice models. But when you combine them with a nice prediction pipeline, it allows you to get really good information about what changes work and what changes don't. So we bring value in many different ways, but we've done kind of different things. So with Redken, for example, we've done, they have essentially used our platform to do this nice analysis of how much attention certain pieces of the product had. With L'Oreal, we've done this nice analysis of specific scenes and whether they are easier to remember or harder to remember. And we found this cool pattern where you actually have hair that is being interacted with human hands. You get much, much higher ad recall, specifically on those scenes. And then we've looked specifically at influencer content, and it turns out that you can look at things like CTR memorability to see essentially if there are certain patterns that work better than others. And there are some interesting things like usually like quick cuts and sharp cuts tend to decrease your memorability, although they increase your attention in context. With Notco, we've done this very cool thing where we essentially run through our entire pipeline. They generated ads with us. They then tested them, modified them, and then put them in the field and compare them with ads that their human teams were making. And it turns out that ours won in many different categories, including cost per engagement and engagement rates, things like that. All right, let me talk a little bit about the research related to this. And this is the part that I find very fun. Hopefully you, you think the same. I'm a researcher at heart, of course. So there's a lot of cool research related to these topics that connects to the idea of whether there are general patterns in the human brain that can be extracted and can be predicted. So is the human brain generally across populations and across ethnicities and across countries reacting in a similar way to certain pieces of content? And it turns out that some cases, yes, and very strongly with high correlation, you can measure that. So I'm going to talk about a few interesting pieces of research connected to our core pillars, but not part of memorable. The first one is this idea of memorability. Memorability is essentially this metric that tells you whether a human will remember a given image after being seen once. This concept was essentially discovered some 10 years ago by my advisor and her team. And she found that it turns out there are images that have these intrinsic properties that make them more memorable because of how our brains are wired. That metric is surprisingly consistent. So if you test different sets of observers and you ask them both, run them both through the same experiment to see what they will remember, it turns out they remember the same things in the same order. So they tend to remember, there's a set of images that tend to remember very highly. There's a set of images that tend to forget very easily. And that happens, again, across ethnicities, cultures, across age ranges even. It's a very cool paper that came out not long ago that shows that essentially if you test teenagers versus older adults, the ordering in the probability of recall of different pieces of content is the same, or it's really highly correlated. There are some really cool, interesting insights. So there are certain shapes, for example, that are more memorable than others in general. There are, of course, some classic insights that are quite intuitive, like the fact that the human brain tends to remember faces much more than landscapes. The cool thing about that insight is that it's not correlated with aesthetics. So I can show you a beautiful mountain range and you will still forget it much, much faster with a higher probability on the face of someone you've never met. There are other concepts that are quite cool, like the human brain tends to remember round shapes more than square shapes and other patterns like that. The other interesting kind of dimension of this is that it's really not intuitive. So humans are only kind of slightly better than chance at really discovering or being able to say if an asset will be remembered or not. There's a lot of very cool papers related to this. Happy to share a presentation and look at it, but just to get into kind of the takeaways, you can see this idea of high memorable things and low memorable things, not only in images as a whole, but in specific categories of images too. So if you go into animals, you can have example of those images containing animals that tend to be highly memorable, and others that are not memorable at all. Same thing happens with objects, with scenes, with people and faces. So there are kind of subcategories in there. Not only that, people have found, and this is very, very cool research, that you can apply modifications in certain images to essentially increase or decrease the memorability. So you can take a face and with small changes, make it so that it's more forgettable. Or you can do the same with generated images, like the dog on the right. So there are tons of memorability patterns, but the takeaway here is that memorability, although very strong, highly unintuitive, and surprisingly consistent, it is not connected to the typical like image factors like colors, saturation, hue, really not correlated with that at all. So it's not like there's a color that will make it more memorable. There's no hue that will make more, there's no saturation level that will make an image more memorable generally. It's much more connected to a semantic concept. There is some kind of connection with some emotions. So there are emotions that tend to be more memorable than others in general. Things like disgust, it's quite memorable, for example. If you see something disgusting, you tend to remember it. And there's a kind of a small correlation with aesthetics that is not super strong in some experiments and stronger in others. This is a cool visualization from one of the main papers that discovered this pattern. That essentially shows how human perceptions of memorability change with the actual memorability of a certain image. So what you're seeing here is essentially two axes. the vertical axis shows you ground truth memorability. So higher on that axis means that the image is actually measurably more or easier to remember. The x-axis here is essentially what people think about that image, whether they think it's going to be an image that they will remember or whether they think it's going to be an image that they will forget. And what you see is that there are kind of different clumps. And an interesting one is the one that's over here, right? The one that where people think that the image will be forgotten, but it's actually super memorable. You see some interesting patterns, like there are some syncs or some, I don't know, hardcore focuses on some people or some weird positions, some funny images. And of course, there are some images that are quite memorable or that people think that will be quite memorable, but are actually extremely forgettable. And here you see your typical landscapes, right? People see a nice waterfall and think, oh, I'm going to remember that. You actually forget it super, super fast. So how do you capture this idea? Well, there are many variations of this, but the core idea to capturing memorability data is to play a simple repetition game. So essentially you show a bunch of images or a bunch of videos, one after the other, and you play some repeats inside of that sequence. And then you ask people, do your best, try to detect the repeats. And so they see this and they try to, I don't know, click, press space bar, do something like that when they see a repeat. And what you see, if you're smart about the way that you post-process that data and the way that you build that experiment, is that you can get, by aggregating over multiple players, very, very good probabilities to the probability of very, very good estimations, the probability of recall to certain images. So quite simple idea. And once you get that data, what you can do is you can build a model that can regress those numbers. And those models tend to learn some interesting patterns about the semantics of those images that allow them to regress this. So at Memorable, we essentially build models like this that are, of course, much more complex than this little box, but they achieve amazing, essentially amazingly low error in the prediction of memorability. For videos, I'm going to skip through this, but essentially published a paper a few years ago where we show that if you have multiple streams of information from different kind of dimensions of the video, and you ask a model to not only predict memorability, but also predict the rate of decay of that memorability as time goes on, and you try to ask the model to also caption the video, you can get really, really good at predicting the memorability for a given. Let me talk a little bit about attention or saliency. So human visual saliency is this entire field about trying to understand where human eyes will go on a given piece of image or a given piece of content. So this is kind of an interesting idea as well, because generally what you do to measure saliency is you aggregate kind of eye fixations over this eye tracker or something that you put on top of people. And that kind of aggregation of fixations can evolve over time. And again, we see kind of this high consistency across observers in low presentation times. And what's interesting about saliency is that as you give more time for someone to explore an image, they tend to kind of vary in what they look at. They tend to start looking at different things. So saliency, again, we see this cool consistency. Observers tend to look at the same thing if in the first few seconds of looking at an image. There are strong advances that are super recent. So there's been kind of research in the last 5 or 6 years that shows good increases in this, and MIT is a big player. And it's generally hard to collect at scale. So it's not easy to get people in the lab and put an eye tracker over them and start collecting that data. So you have to find other ways to kind of capturing this. Again, some cool papers, feel free to check them out. Some of them we published a few years ago. The way that we capture this, eye tracking, super, super painful. It doesn't scale. But it turns out that you can leverage that with web browser experiments. So there's a very cool paper that essentially explores this technique to capturing the data that is quite kind of innovative, but super correlated with what you get with eye trackers, which is essentially show people an image, make it disappear, and then show a grid of codes, a grid of like 3-letter codes all over the place. And after that, you make that grid of code disappear. You show that grid of codes only for a very short amount of time. And then you ask people to enter the code that they saw. What happens is that if you show the image, make it disappear, and then pop that grid of codes for a very short time, in the order of a few hundred milliseconds, people are only able to remember one 3-letter code. that corresponds to the last point that they were looking at in the image that was shown before. So if you then ask them to input that code, you essentially get one sample of what they were looking at in the image that you were showing. You repeat that experiment multiple times, and you get these nice little samples of what people are looking at different exposition times in the image. And if you aggregate that, you can get really nice estimations of saliency. Predicting it, machine learning model, but this time a little bit different, where you essentially input an image or a video and try to regress something that looks like an image or a video, but it's actually this map of essentially probability, or kind of a probability distribution or an estimated probability distribution of where the eye will tend to go when they look at this image in the first few seconds or in the first n seconds, depending on how you collected the data. One cool pattern that we found a few years ago in a paper that we published is this idea: things are different. Different things are salient at different times. So there are some really nice patterns, but one that really stand out is this one, the kind of boomerang pattern that we found in a good chunk of the data, which essentially looks like this. So first, what you're seeing here essentially in the x-axis is how much people look at faces. Higher in this axis means people are looking more at faces. And in the x-axis, what you're seeing is time. So what happens at the beginning, what they're looking at in the first 0.5 seconds, what they're looking at in the 3 seconds that happen after, and then what they're looking at in the next 5 seconds. And what you see is that as soon as you show the image in the first 0.5 seconds, people immediately look at faces. After that, they tend to decrease their attention to faces, they look at other things, and then they go back to the face. Very cool pattern that happened in 33% of the data we analyzed. And it looks a little bit like this. So people kind of look at the faces, then they move away from the faces and they tend to look at what people are interacting with. So essentially the board or something else, and then they go back to the face. That's one of the patterns that we found. There's another very strong pattern, which is decreasing, where people tend to look at the face and then move away and immediately focus on the object that people are gonna interact with. And there's this interesting archery example where people try to kind of look at the face and they move into the bow itself and then into the target that bow is gonna hit, and that arrow is gonna hit. So here are the images a little bit bigger. Cool patterns, and it's interesting because those patterns, again, you can find them in a good chunk of the data and they're consistent across observers. Finally, how do you predict social media performance metrics? So that's kind of another pillar of our set of predictions related to things that matter for marketing, right? One thing that we need to predict really well at Memorable is essentially performance metrics, things like your CTR, your CPC, your cost per engagement, things like that. And as you very well said at the beginning, this is audience intelligence. So we're moving into a field of metrics that are not that consistent across observers anymore. They're actually dependent on who you show things to. So essentially, when you look at kind of more low-level things like memory and attention, people tend to be consistent, specifically at low times. When you go into things that require more of a behavioral approach or require some kind of interaction, like actually clicking on an image, you have to be a little bit more careful about how to predict it, and you need to introduce information about the audience that you're showing that item to. So the age, gender, the type of CPA that you're showing, etc. And here it's quite straightforward as well. So you can build machine learning models that are a little bit complex, that take into account not only the image or representations of the image, but also all the information about that targeting to predict things like CTR and CPC. And the cool thing is that if you have a model that can predict that reasonably well, you can kind of replace A/B tests. You can look at 2 items, input your audience that you're going to show with, input your placement, your channel, information about your context, and then the model can tell you with high confidence whether one image will perform better than the other, one ad will perform better than the other. So once you have a model that performs well here, you essentially save tons and tons of time and money in A/B tests because of this ability of having really good impressions of whether an asset will perform better before even testing. We've done some cool research here. Some of them recently featured at CVPR 2023 about how to predict this really well, like introduce different things about information about the image to essentially predict this. This is a paper specifically on predicting memorability on CTR. But it turns out that if you combine multiple things related to saliency, related to information about the objects in the scene and raw perception, you can get really good estimations of memorability. So to close out, what's next? Why does this matter? Who cares about this? There's a lot of really cool areas where this could be applied. And I know that Marc is interested in going a little bit into this. So I'm briefly going to touch on this. It turns out that understanding cognitive impact is really strong for brand marketing, which is kind of where we're starting. But it can be used for many other things. It can be used for entertainment, for creators and influencers. It can be used for online learning. It can be used for music and sound ads, if you sounds. So essentially, right now, measuring the ability to, having the ability to measure things like attention and memory on certain assets is of course extremely good for brand marketing. But as you become better at being able to predict whether someone will remember, it becomes really strong to start bringing those ideas into things like education, where you could potentially in the future optimize some slides to ensure that the slide that transmits the core piece of content is super memorable, or where you ensure that the key visualization, it draws a lot of attention. Of course, with memorable, we're starting here, but we know that this tech can be applied in a lot of different areas. I think that 10 years from now, this world will look a little bit different than what it looks today. We've seen the rise of ChatGPT and other techniques, and what that leads to is essentially a world of co-pilots, a world of agents that can guide you through different tasks that you do in your day-to-day. Assistants that can understand context, that can understand different dimensions of a certain piece of content that you're working with, and then guide you towards your task. That's going to be true for many different things. What we think is that specifically in the world of marketing, there's a good chance that a copilot looks like the one that we're building, where you understand all of your past, you can test your present, and then you can generate for the future. So that's all. It's all about us, and I hope the small piece of research was interesting. Thank you.
Yep.
Should I stop sharing?
All right. Thank you, Camilo. Super interesting.
Thank you.
So I'm sure that a lot of the audience today is curious just to bottom line us with certain things. So, for example, let's go back to the Hellmann's, where you started, the Hellmann's ad campaign. I'll admit, as a person that owns an advertising agency for more than 20 years, I think more than 30 years now, the campaign on the right, I was convinced was going to be more effective. The image of the product kept coming out at the viewer, and I said, naturally, that's the one. So scientifically speaking, why is that not the more memorable? Maybe it's more impactful, but the more memorable campaign?
That's a good question. I'd have to double check the actual memorability values for those two. I'm not sure if there's that much of a difference. I think the main difference between those two campaigns was mostly on CPC, how essentially one was much more clickable than the other, right? Easier to click. There's another important thing, which is that when you look at one image or one video, it's generally hard to give good explanations as to why a certain metric is as it is, right? As to why, for example, the memorability is high for this thing. Of course, you can guide yourself with patterns that say, oh yeah, landscapes are less memorable. This image features a landscape. It's probably one of the components that is making that image less memorable, right? So for that Hellmann's campaign, it's hard to go to the specific details of that and say, the reason why CPC is 7 times higher than the other is this, or it's this transition.
I see.
We're working on that, on ways to kind of get information about the why, but generally it's not directly interpretable. And that's what actually makes it unintuitive, right? That's the reason why humans can't kind of gather these general rules and general patterns that tell them, given an image, oh, it follows patterns ABC, so I can tell that it's going to be more memorable or more clickable.
So then,
that's why you need a machine learning model.
Right. So effectively what you're saying is that we couldn't predict or create a set of general ground rules to predict how to best sell or present a product in an ad campaign.
Exactly. If you go into the super details, you can't really set rules that work all the time. You can, of course, extract general patterns that are interesting and that will improve your performance if you tend to follow them. But if you go to the exact detail, if you're faced with two advertisements and you need to know which one is better than the other, you can't just rely on those general patterns. You need something more precise.
Where does the science come into play as it relates to emotion? This might be beyond the scope of memorable AI, but again, as a person who owns an advertising agency, I have believed for a very long time that experiential marketing is more powerful today in creating an emotional bond between the customer and the brand than any traditional advertising campaign. So is there a way to use artificial intelligence to predict, I guess, or to gauge how the emotional response will be from the viewer of the campaign?
Yes, absolutely. That's a field that I love, actually. So there's an entire kind of field of research that is dedicated to predicting emotions in two different ways. One of them is emotions portrayed by human actors in a scene, and the other one is evoked emotion. So if I see a piece of content, what emotion does it generate to the viewer as a viewer, right? So what I can say there is in Memorable, we've been exploring that. We actually have a few things coming up soon that will allow you to predict things more related to evoked emotion. And in research in general, the consensus is that if you have enough data for specific subsets of images or videos, you can make accurate predictions, but it tends to be a little bit, how do you say that? It has a kind of a high margin of error. And that's mostly because evoked emotions don't have the same pattern of consistency as you can see in things like attention or memory. It's not, you take two different subgroups of people, the correlation between the evoked emotions that those people will feel given an exposure to a certain piece of content will not correlate as much as things like memory or attention. So it's a little bit harder to make those predictions. You need to go deeper into kind of properties about the people that you're going to show that piece of content to give a good prediction.
So are there some generalizations that our audience could walk away with today? For example, I think during one image you said people tend to remember disgusting images, which, you know, I think that's fun and that captures my attention. Do they feel the same? Or does your data show that the same response might be for an image that shows two people in love or anything like this? Are there just certain takeaways? You said that round seems to be better performing than square. So like, lay it out for us. Like, I'm sure everybody in this room at the very minimal wants to create a stronger engagement with their social media, right? So give us some tips, give us some just baseline generalizations.
Yeah, absolutely. We found some interesting patterns in the data. Again, the kind of the disclaimer is that this is not a rule that works all the time, right? It's patterns that you see that don't necessarily apply to a very specific asset. But yeah, there are some interesting things. So things that are disgusting, things that generate fear. So images that are kind of scary are generally more memorable. And I'm in the realm of kind of ad recall and memorability here. Things that are sexy, of course, are also memorable. In fact, if you run memory games with some images that have not necessarily nudity, but showing some skin, those things pop up super high in memorability. People remember their skin. So that's another kind of interesting connected concept there. What's also interesting is that in the realm of things that are not easily remembered, you have things like contentment and joy, which is interesting. And so I don't have an answer as to why that happens, but I think that it might be connected to another very important concept in the realm of memorability, which is distinctiveness. When you show things that are very distinctive, they tend to pop up and tend to be remembered more. There's kind of a modulation effect that increases the raw memorability of an asset, depending on the context where you show it, depending on what you've seen right before and what you're going to see right after. And so for joy and for contentment, for those kinds of emotions, I think they don't pop up as much. They're not as distinctive generally from what you tend to see. You tend to see lots of images of people smiling or generally happy. And that might be one of the reasons why they don't pop up as much in the memorability chart. Right?
So sex and car crashes, high memory, right? We all
Sadly,
love
yes.
sex and car crashes, but just pure bliss, forget about it.
Sadly, yes. And you know, I think social media platforms have discovered that quite well. I mean, if you look at kind of a default TikTok reel today, it's like, yeah, scary stuff, sexy stuff, and shocking stuff, one after the other. So definitely kind of more, yeah, it tends to be remembered more and more attention grabbing.
So beyond the science, in your experience, I think it's really compelling that you're saying people tend to first look at another person's image, their face. But beyond the science, why do you think that is? Why do you think, you know, just from an emotional perspective, because you're really deep into it, right? So you're thinking about this a lot, probably more than the average person. So why do we look at an individual's face first?
That's interesting. Beyond the science, I'm not sure how much I can give you.
Spoken like a real PhD.
Yeah, definitely. So I think the reason why people look at faces, or at least what the research community thinks, is that there are some hardwired kind of very fast pathways in our brain that kind of attract us to things that look like faces. And that's something that's hardwired as babies. In fact, there's some research that is well known, you probably know it, that tested how infants reacted to things that looked like faces, things that didn't look like faces, and faces that were inverted. And what they found is that toddlers tend to have this instinctive reaction where if you show them something that looks like a face, they tend to turn their head towards that. But if you turn that around, if you invert that face, they lose attention to it. They don't tend to turn their head towards it that much. Remember the exact details of that research. I hope I'm not butchering it too much, but yeah, you can see that in toddlers, you can see that in babies, right? So it looks like there's definitely some kind of hardwired neural pathways that make us immediately look at faces. And that probably then gets translated into us being A, more attentive to faces when we look at an image, and B, being able to remember faces more. Sorry, I gave you the science perspective.
No, that's fine. That's fine. That's perfect. That's perfect. I understand that's your background. The concept of color theory is super compelling too. If I understand correctly, you're saying there is no distinct color as it impacts our ability to remember.
To remember, yeah, that's right. And I want to be very specific there. So if you look very specifically at the memorability metric, right? Specifically at that, there's no correlation with color. There's no one color that makes you consistently more memorable. Or said another way, you can find images that have any color as their main dominant color, and you can find examples that are highly memorable and examples that are low memorability. This does not hold true for other cognitive metrics like attention. In attention, there are definitely some colors that tend to be more attention grabbing, like red.
I see. So is that also driven by emotion as it relates to color? Because I read a report not too long ago that showed the Pepto-Bismol pink, that iconic kind of blue-based pink, actually creates a certain level of happiness with people more so than other colors. So should brand marketers be thinking about both? I think what you're talking about is how do we trigger transactions? How do we create revenue? How do we create sales? But to build brand equity in the pure definition, should marketers still be thinking about this other part of the equation, the emotion?
Definitely. So as a general concept, emotion definitely impacts your ability to generate brand equity and your ability to generate brand lift, right? To measurable brand lift. Now, how does that relate to color specifically? That's a little bit more murky. I know that there are indeed some associations, like some colors are associated with certain emotions. I'm definitely not an expert in that space. But what I would say is, yes, there are some connections that can be leveraged. I think the stronger connection to leverage to ensure brand equity connected to colors is one thing that we've seen that is very effective, which is consistency. So in the realm of generating brand equity, in the realm of generating brand lift, if you're consistent about the colors that you show as your brand, that is beneficial. That is beneficial for multiple things. One of them is you generate more brand association, right? People tend to associate that combination of product, color, and even style of your imagery to your brand. And that has a positive impact generally on brand equity. Yeah, but I don't know. I don't know much more connected to the emotion part, but color definitely important, emotion definitely important.
Camilo, three of the pillars, I think you had 4 pillars that we were analyzing, but 3 of the pillars really caught my attention. Attention, distinctiveness, and aesthetics. And I'm curious, do one of those pillars carry more weight with regards to memorability than the others?
That's a really good question. So they're all interconnected, right? So when you're trying to predict one of these metrics, knowing information about one of the others is definitely useful for your prediction. But you can also make a prediction without necessarily knowing that other one, and you can still be very accurate. Now, specifically, like the path of how metric A, B, and C connect to memorability, what we're seeing is the following. First, the distribution of attention influences your memorability. And the general pattern that I can say here is that generally, if your attention is more concentrated, your memorability tends to be a little bit higher. The correlation is not super high, it's kind of weak, but you still see that pattern. So essentially having, less points of attention, and a more focused image that kind of funnels the human gaze towards 2 or 3 points, that tends to be beneficial for memorability. And also for many other things. We've seen correlation to brand lift, correlation to CTR, for example. So that things become more clickable when they're more focused. So that's about attention. If you go to aesthetics, as I said, not that correlated. The correlation is very weak with memorability. There is a little bit of a connection, but it's very weak. So you can definitely find images that are low aesthetics, very kind of, I don't know, bad.
So gone are the days of superior photography, superior design. We don't really need that anymore.
It depends on your objective. Yeah, if your objective is purely ad recall, you don't necessarily need it. You can have a very kind of ugly image that will be remembered a lot. A very good example of this is an analysis that we did for the Coinbase ad in the Super Bowl. I don't know if you remember in Super Bowl back in, I think, 21 or 22, yes. I don't remember. Coinbase had this ad. It was literally a QR code bouncing around.
Sure.
And that score is really low in any measure of aesthetics, but extremely high in memorability, extremely high in ad recall and in brand lift. So definitely, you don't need aesthetics to be remembered. Now, you do need aesthetics for potentially other things, like, generating brand equity, in some cases, making you more clickable, things like that.
So how does memorability then convert to sales?
That's one thing that we have been exploring in many different directions. So there are different aspects to this, but the main kind of dimension that is interesting is that there are quite a few studies that show that ad recall has about a 0.6 to 0.7 correlation to sales lift. There's a very cool Nielsen study that shows that directly, right? Like ad recall is directly connected with a very high correlation. 0.7 in this word is quite high. It's directly connected to brand lift. So if people remember your ads more, people tend to buy more from you. So there's definitely a connection. Now, there are many different aspects, so ways of measuring ad recall and memorability that connect more and less to the idea of sales. And there's also some indirect connections where it's harder to measure the ultimate impact on sale, but you know that memorability impacts something that ultimately leads to higher sales. For example, click-through rates. We've seen that for some important performance metrics, memorability is a very good base predictor. It's a very good kind of feature that you can give a model to improve its performance on adjusting to that click-through rate. So there's an interesting connection there. So many ways of measuring how it leads to sales ultimately, but no matter how you look at it, it looks like it's definitely beneficial.
So beyond just brand marketing and advertising, when you start to get into the arts, for example, the latter part of your presentation, I think it's interesting. So let's think in terms of like fine art, like if we think about it competitively, like, do you think based upon what you're explaining today, the Mona Lisa has a higher retention rate than maybe Picasso's Guernica because the Mona Lisa is a person's face, whereas Guernica though is a car crash, right? So you're familiar with Guernica, you're Spanish, yeah? So you're, right? So where does it fit in? Like, do you think that's part of why some of these pieces of artwork are, have like seeped into the fabric of society and will never kind of disappear? Like, why is the Mona Lisa so popular?
That's a very interesting question. Like, I wonder if there's actually a connection to the raw memorability. That would be an interesting study to do, right? Like, is there in the in the most well-known pieces of art throughout history, do you see higher memorability than the average piece of art?
And then
cool.
And then disgusting too, right? Like when you start to get into like Picasso's Cubism era, if you look at perhaps his image of La Mujer and El Espejo and beyond, like perhaps there's a component where it's a face, but then it's like mangled and it's more memorable.
It's very possible. It's very possible. That's something interesting to dive into. What I can tell you here is that there's first one thing to disentangle, which is the some pieces of art are more memorable or more well-known, not necessarily because of their raw memorability, but because of all the history and all the different things surrounding it. You know, type of artist, how it was showcased, whether it's taught in schools or not. All those things, of course, impact how strong the piece of art is. There's a super cool study that came out not long ago that there was a Wired article on from a cool lab, the Bainbridge lab. Wilma Bainbridge was, I think, a PhD student with my advisor, and she's now studying very cool dimensions around memorability. And she recently published this paper which shows that there is a correlation in, or there are some kind of consistently strong responses to how memorable a piece of art is. So they did this cool thing where they had people walk around a museum and then they asked them, okay, what piece of art do you remember? And what they showed is that there are definitely some consistent patterns. So some pieces of art are more remembered by the average human than others, which for me was very interesting because when I think about memorability, it's more of a kind of base level pattern that is really impactful in everyday images, but that gets a little bit murkier when you think about images where your personal preferences come into play. Right? So all of these things.
It's really interesting. And then if you extend that a little further, then today, like all of us are listening. We all have headphones in our ears all the time, whether we're on the subway or in the gym or walking on the street. Sonic branding matters. And I know at the end of your chart, you had music towards the end. Is there any finding or generalization as to like how brands can, you know, cut through the clutter and literally cut through the noise to reach an individual's memory best?
Yeah, definitely. I'm not an expert in that area, but I know that there are several papers that show that you can find similar effects on audio. You can find certain pieces of audio that are consistently more memorable than others and easier to remember. And if I'm not mistaken, some things that they found were that ambient sounds are, of course, less memorable, and sounds that are a little bit more surprising tend to be more memorable, that have some like distinct feature, something like that.
So that's the common theme. Like if there's like a shock, something to get one's attention, it becomes more memorable.
It looks
not necessarily better, but just memorable.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. That's a really good distinction, by the way, because more memorable doesn't necessarily mean better. It depends all on your ultimate objective. But yes, I think those are some of the patterns. I think there's a pattern related to human voices as well. Human voices are more memorable than ambient sounds. And I think there's also a pattern related to the pitch of that voice, but I don't remember exactly. I have to double check the paper. So yeah, to answer your question, there are definitely things to leverage in sound to also achieve like higher ad recall and things like that. And we plan to get into that with memorable in the future.
Very cool. So over the past 3 days, a lot of our guests have discussed the concept of how artificial intelligence can level the playing field. And in our room, obviously, we have a lot of young, creative, entrepreneurial minds, and I'm sure our audience on YouTube as well. I'm curious, is your product going to help, let's say, entrepreneurs and small businesses compete against some of these big multinational corporations that you currently have as clients?
That's a really good question. My answer right now is that in the future, yes, but memorable at the moment is focused on ensuring that we can bring value mostly to these clients that are more interested in branding and in awareness. Many of our features give you a lot of value in that field where you couldn't find it that much before. Smaller companies or smaller players are generally more interested in pure performance, right? Like pure CTR, or does this get me more web page visits?
Sure.
And in that aspect, there's kind of a smaller gap in what exists today in terms of information that you can gather and things that you can test versus in awareness, where the gap of information and measurement capabilities is so large between what we can do and what already exists. There's kind of a very, very large blue sky there to leverage, and that's why we're focusing on these big companies first. But to go to your question, I think that in the future, so one part of the platform right now is being open to kind of the mid-market, and in the future it will be kind of completely open, so everyone will be able to go in, make a quick account, and start testing stuff. And in that dimension, specifically looking at performance, yes, there are some kind of quick ways that you can get information that will typically take your marketing team to have, that will massively improve your ability to compete with these big brands. So yes, long-term, yes. Right now we have lots of features that are focused on big brands.
So what kind of an impact can that have, or do you predict your product will have on the advertising sector? For example, will people need to have new skills so they can develop strategies surrounding your product? Will individuals' job descriptions change? Will it nullify certain jobs?
Hopefully not. Hopefully it doesn't nullify but transform.
Realistically
right?
speaking?
Right.
Will it create new jobs?
So it could be. It could be. I think right now it's a little bit early to think about, and honestly, being very humble here, I don't think what we're building is so revolutionary that it will like kill jobs and create new ones. But what it definitely will do is that it will bring tools that weren't available before that will massively improve the ability to get insights quickly and improve creative in an effective manner. And in that way, I don't know if it will kind of create or make jobs disappear, but it will definitely change the workflow loop that some people have when they're creating their campaigns or making their assets. Instead of spending hours kind of analyzing what worked and what didn't, and how did my top assets perform and things like that, and whether instead of spending lots and lots of hours A/B testing different things, you're now able to plug into our platform and get those insights immediately, test stuff in seconds. So your workflow changes, right? Your ability to output things changes. The way that you actually improve a certain asset also changes. It's gonna be moving from intuition and small tweaks here and there and kind of, I don't know, a committee of artists deciding what they think is the right direction, to something where a tool that can give you kind of very accurate predictions is immediately embedded into those decisions. So instead of saying, yeah, I think this looks better, you're saying, I think this looks better. And at the same time, the platform is telling me that it will perform better than the alternative. So that I think that fundamentally changes because you're having a constant co-pilot, right? It is guiding your decisions.
Yeah, but the amount of data that you said you've trained the AI on it sounds ridiculously impressive, but how do you know it's accurate? Like, how could a company like P&G or Unilever or Bayer, they have so much at stake. How can they just lean in and rely on you knowing that your research and the data that's been put into the artificial intelligence, the way it's been trained, is accurate?
Constantly testing with real data. So in our process, we do that in multiple stages. At the beginning, when people are onboarding with us, we do a pilot where we essentially test out our predictions versus the real data. So we put the ads out there. The ads get a certain level of CTR, or we put the ads out there on the actual cognitive experiments that allow you to get the real ground truth memorability. And we correlate that to the predictions that we're getting. We give very accurate, or we give very transparent levels of error so that people can know what happens with a test asset. And then while they're using our platform, periodically, we also open the door to doing those small tests where a certain asset that was optimized by a company is also put out there to check kind of real performance and see how it goes. We're now actually bringing another feature into our platform. Well, it's in the roadmap. Hopefully we can release it soon. And it's this ability to essentially measure how something is doing while it's in flight. So essentially you can see how an asset that you posted is performing, whether it's doing well, whether it's getting some ad fatigue, things like that. And in that process, you can immediately go back and check with our predictions and see if what it's actually getting correlates with what we tell you it would get before you posted it.
Amazingly valuable, incredible, actually, really incredible. And then with AI, the brands will be able to modify the campaign if they need to, as you're analyzing the in-flight performance.
That's one thing I want to do. So we want to essentially,
Incredible.
highlight, hey, this ad is generating some fatigue. Swap it with this version that we predict will perform well, and we'll have kind of the same concept.
Super valuable, amazing. Have you worked in any sectors beyond CPG and beyond the spirits category? Is there a notable campaign that you've impacted beyond those categories that you can share with the group today?
So we've worked mostly with CPG brands, but there were some kind of experiments with other brands that were more trying to make some campaigns related to lifestyle. So we briefly worked with Biogen, for example, a pharmaceutical company, for some general lifestyle ads and also on some secondary projects related to Alzheimer's. That was super cool. So yes, we have some experiments there, but I would say that most of our clients are CPG right now, and there's a lot of impact surrounding that.
Can you share with us like one of the notable campaigns that we might have all seen and not realized you were behind it?
So I don't know. I don't know if I can share it, but there are a couple of things that are quite interesting. So for example, one thing that I can definitely share, because we have the use case in our website, is the latest Notco campaigns in Latin America. So if you've seen any kind of Notco ad, Notco is this brand of kind of vegan and vegetarian components. So they do, the not mayo, not burgers, all of those things. And we were behind many of those campaigns that were quite successful in Latin America. So I showed, I think, one nugget example out there, and we have others.
So what's the sales process like when you sit down in a room with the folks from Procter & Gamble and try to explain to these traditional advertisers why your technology is better than what they're used to? How do you convince them? Is that a difficult, hurdle to get over?
Yeah, definitely. That's one of the main steps that that we need to pass to get this in the door. But there's an interesting kind of concept there, or an interesting pattern that we've seen. Before this explosion of AI, there was definitely a lot of convincing, a lot of kind of information about AI is strong, it can be accurate, and it can be useful for your workflow. And here are all the ways that it can be useful. And so, yes, we did spend a lot of time, mostly in this pilot period, kind of convincing people that our predictions were accurate and that AI was going to be very useful as a co-pilot for their workflow. And it wasn't so easy to kind of convince people of that and to educate people around AI and around the power that it brings. After, DALL-E, Stable Diffusion, and ChatGPT, much easier.
Right.
We've seen a completely different pattern where people know that AI is fundamentally strong and can be kind of very value adding. And they're much more on a dimension of, all right, where can this help me? Like show me exactly where it helps, but I do believe that it can be helpful, that it can be useful co-pilot.
It's really becoming ubiquitous. In my ride uptown today, this morning, I saw a Microsoft ad surrounding AI, and I saw an IBM ad surrounding AI. So it truly is ubiquitous. So, for our group, again, this audience is entrepreneurial and obviously career oriented, and they wouldn't be here if they weren't interested in artificial intelligence. So talk a little bit about the entrepreneur part of you. Like, when did you come up with the idea of creating this business, and how did you bring it to market?
That was a long and arduous path.
I'm sure.
Lots of turns and interesting things. But the idea actually stemmed from kind of the general research directions that I was following in my PhD. Like, I was working on all of these things that were able to, predicting mobility and understand how the brain would react to different visual inputs. And at that point, I was actually working with Sebas, my co-founder and the CEO of Memorable. We met at Harvard. He was kind of doing an MBA and very interested in all of the projects surrounding AI. And we started collaborating on some projects. We made some models for things like infrastructure predictions and COVID predictions that we sold to some governments. Started doing some projects together.
Just projects that you sold to governments.
Yeah, things like that.
Got it.
And in 2021, we said, hey, there's this cool kind of dimensions that could be useful in some areas. Essentially said, look, there's some tech that could be useful. What can we do with it? And Sebas immediately had like 10,000 ideas and people to talk to and things to do to see how it works. So we started essentially talking with many people in the marketing industry and in the education kind of world. And we started seeing that there was some interest in being able to predict these cognitive metrics. But specifically in marketing, we saw kind of this hunger and this need to make good predictions for the realm of, branding and awareness. And back in 2021, we started collaborating when we were super early with actually L'Oreal and Unilever. They were our first or early adopters. And we started kind of, interacting with them and seeing what product we could build that would be useful for them. And at the beginning, we just, gave them predictions in spreadsheets, like basic things like that. And then we started building a platform that was aligned to what they needed, and that became memorable. And so, after that, by the end of 2021, we actually cold emailed this super smart guy, Brian O'Kelly. He's one of the guys that kind of pioneered the online ad exchange, that microsecond bidding that happens. He was the CEO of AppNexus, very, very strong programmatic company. And he did, lots of very cool stuff in the ad space. And we kind of cold emailed him and say, hey, we have this tech. We think it could be useful. Are you interested? And he said, yeah, of course, let's talk. And so we had multiple kind of meetings with him. And at the end, he said, this is awesome. I want to be your angel investor. And I want to kind of open the doors. And so he did. He was super helpful at the beginning. He even kind of proposed to help us out with some pieces of code, things like that. He essentially introduced us to many of his friends and investors and clients. And we really kind of took off with his guidance at the beginning. And from that, we started kind of growing a lot. So we started getting some good clients. Then we raised a pre-seed. And now, we're a almost 20 people company with really good kind of growth rates and perspectives for just from jumping straight to Series A next year if everything goes well.
So what's the most complicated part surrounding fundraising?
There are many complicated parts. I don't know if I can pinpoint kind of the most complicated one. So I think one big challenge for me was understanding kind of VC speak and how to communicate an idea like this effectively to them. There's really kind of a set of strategies and set of heuristics that make you more effective at communicating your idea and your venture to VCs. And those heuristics are different than the way that you communicate that venture to a group of researchers or to the general public. So learning those techniques was definitely one of the most challenging parts.
Can you share one with the group, like just one idea specifically?
Yeah. So one thing that for me was striking is that VCs want to ensure that your company is going to be not only successful, but $1 billion company. And in some cases, you can showcase your technology and your growth and your idea in a way that makes it look really good, but doesn't necessarily give the VC that impression that you're going to be a unicorn. And if you manage to do that, you can be very satisfied with your presentation, but have a VC that is not interested in investing in you because they really want to invest in those ideas that they think will become massively large. So you have to kind of tailor the way that you explain how you're going to grow in such a way that shows a path towards becoming massive. And you have to find a way to do that.
That sounds complicated, right? Because it's
Definitely.
blue sky.
Super blue sky. And in the early stages, you have no idea how you're going to grow. But you have to, be principled and find some general patterns, information about companies that are similar, information about how your market is growing, all of that, to kind of show, yes, look, I not only have a good idea and some early traction, I also have a clear path that, of course, has a low probability of actual success. Everyone knows that, but there is at least a path and a kind of principal plan to get to being a unicorn.
So VC funding comes in 21, 22, and then
So,
you're off to the races. Now you have a team of 20, 30 people. How involved are the investors in your day-to-day operation? Is that a big project also in managing those relationships?
Yeah, definitely. They are, I think, somewhat involved. I think close to the average of how VCs are involved with a company. We are generally more connected to our early angel investors. So Brian O'Kelly, Michael Kassan, those are kind of very, very good resources for us. And they're always, I don't know, we have kind of a closer relationship.
Michael came from the advertising community too, right?
Oh yeah, Michael Kassan,
Yeah,
of course.
yeah.
Media Link.
Yeah.
Another legend. He's
Yeah.
super, super smart. Investors are definitely super helpful. In fact, I have a call with them later this afternoon, and they are helpful in different ways. So some investors are very helpful at connecting us with the right people to, for example, get a deal done or get hiring done. Some other investors are super helpful with strategy and with dealing with tough decisions, knowing what to do and what direction to move in. There's one investor in particular that is very close, and it's kind of the first call that we have when we have a problem. We're like, hey, we have this, what should we do?
So it seems like you're really attracted to strategic investors, not just the money.
Yeah, definitely. And I think, well, it's a personal opinion, but I think it's generally a good direction to go into. When you're looking for money, it's always better to find VCs that first are connected with your general area and will be able to give you, insights that are good for what you're trying to build. And second, yes, that have kind of a good strategic mind. Specifically for first-time founders, it's so important to have people that have gone through the motions before and that can tell you this is the right path to go, or given this set of suboptimal decisions, this is the one that you should take. And yeah, that's really invaluable, specifically when you're early and when you're first-time founder like us.
So last question, and then we'll open it up to the audience. I'm curious, given the nature of everybody's backgrounds here as it relates to their point in their stage in life and what they're thinking about, what words of encouragement would you provide our audience if they wanted to become entrepreneurs and start their own businesses today?
So that's a good one. I have several, but I think the one of the ones that for me is most impactful is start now, don't wait. And it's maybe a little bit of a cliche. I know a lot of people do that, but it's so true. I see tons of people that are extremely smart and that kind of delay their introduction to the entrepreneurship world because they're like, I still don't have the best idea yet, or no, the conditions are not right, or I don't want. And all of those things are just not true. And what is true is that it's always going to be kind of a suboptimal time for different things. But even with that, you can make it work. And in fact, starting now is kind of the best way to, get your foot in the door, get a good idea of how the market reacts to ideas. There's tons of ways that you can kind of showcase a given idea or a given piece of tech without necessarily leaving everything behind. And so, starting now and starting doing kind of the basic small pieces that get you information about whether your idea is good or not, I think is extremely valuable. You can do that in so many ways. Nowadays, you can literally post quick ads with ideas and see if people react to them, right? And like lead them to a boilerplate page with some coming soon.
Right.
But that gives you so much information about whether your idea is good or not that, it's valuable to start now.
Because I expect there's going to be a lot of questions.
Sure. So, yeah. Does anybody have a question? Yep. Here we go. So come on up.
Let me start.
Okay.
I have two angles about subsets. Do you see difference when you look at the data demographically? Are women different than men? Are kids different? How much distinction do you see when you look at the data? And have you thought about applying it to political campaigns?
So you definitely see differences across demographics in specific metrics. Again, it depends on the metrics. There are some metrics that are much more kind of affected by demographics than others. So as I said, things like memorability, surprisingly not affected, not that affected by demographics. You can look at, different groups of people, different ethnicities, different age ranges, and you see very high correlations between what they tend to remember and what they don't remember. Of course, there's also an impact in demographics. There is an impact related to culture and things like that, but it's much smaller than in other metrics. Now, when you go to the realm of performance and you look at things like clicks, yes, demographics are extremely important. When you get into the realm of metrics that are more related to personal likes, wants, and needs that are very kind of individual specific or audience specific, your demographics tend to impact a lot. And so yes, we see big differences in CTRs for the same image across genders, age ranges, locations, things like that.
Camilo, what about the second part of the question? It's very interesting, actually, with the political season upon us now, right? As we enter the primary season, how do you see this technology perhaps impacting political advertising?
Well, political advertisement is just another type of advertising, and we help any kind of advertising increase what the metrics that they're interested in, being clicks or being remembered. So yes, we've been approached by political groups that are interested in seeing if we can help them be more memorable.
And will you advise them towards train wreck imagery and sex imagery? Obviously kidding.
Obviously not, right? Yeah, so, and that's another very, very good point. And that's connected to the fact that not being memorable doesn't necessarily mean being better, right?
Right, but it's interesting though, all kidding aside, political advertising has become very much about shock and fear and the negative side of our society.
Yeah, definitely. What we've seen though is, so although of course people are interested in maximizing their impact and memorability and making something more shocking, they also want to kind of maintain a certain brand. And so we've been working with one political campaign in Argentina, for example, where mostly their use of the platform is, they have a few assets that already showcase what they want to showcase. They have many different versions of those assets, and they just see which one scores better in the metrics that they're interested in. One of them mostly is at recall, of course. So there's less of like telling them you should do something sexy and more of like, hey, we have a bunch of different shots of our candidates. Which one's the best?
I see.
Thank you so much for coming. As I guess Marc interested in my question is, would mass use of this service make the content generation more stale in all things? So engine where all have in their own product lines, their competitors. So if they both use this product, how can they both be this?
It's a great question.
That's a great. Yeah, no, that's a great question. So there's many aspects to this. The first one is there are the subtleties around things like how memorable you are, how attention grabbing you are, and how clickable you are so specific that sometimes changing how your model is looking can affect that result. So that means that there are many different ways of being memorable or being clickable. There's not kind of one funnel, one way that everyone will focus on. And in that realm, there's a space where brands can essentially bring their brand image, their sets of colors, their style, etc., and inside of that bubble, find ways of being memorable. If all brands do that, what you'll end up with is with assets that are not necessarily all the same. They can be quite distinct and still all score well in the main aspects that you want them to score well. And on top of that, there's also another important component, which is that context plays a role for most of these metrics, and we measure that directly. So if you place an asset in a context that is very similar to that asset, your asset will not pop out, and that will decrease your memorability and decrease your attention in context. So you're incentivized in kind of switching that and essentially adapting to your context to benefit maximally from that context modulator, right? To do that, you have to adapt. That's one of the things that we do kind of in our models. Our models are periodically retrained with new data and new contexts so that they can adapt to new things. So if you all of a sudden you have a very different campaign that performs in a different way, our models will pick that up and will kind of fine tune CTR predictions for your future assets to adapt to that. And that will definitely give you, again, not that funnel where everything becomes the same, but a funnel where things kind of become really good and then fall out because of fatigue, because of everything is the same, because of context, and then new things pops up. So, yeah.
Thank you so much. For example, if we use memorable for the Coinbase QR code,
yeah,
would we get a good result for it, or would that?
Yeah, absolutely. So if you run that through Memorable, the use cases out there. There's an article about the analysis that we did on Super Bowl. If you run that out through Memorable, what you see is aesthetic super low, memorability super high. And other things like attention in context also very, very high. And that's, yeah, because of the characteristics of that ad. It's so distinctive and so kind of simple. Cognitive load is very low too, that it scores very high in those metrics. Although it looks like it won't perform, right? It looks like, how can it? But it does, yeah. And we picked that up, which is cool.
Sam, thank you so much for coming here today. It was amazing. My case, I'm doing my master's in sports business, also accounting careers, especially in gas and finance. My question is, have you done any work in the sports industry related to the fitness industry with brands or organizations? There's actually a lot of potential here for fun engagement, for retention, for clients, just motivating them to work out. For example, this summer, I worked at a agency. I was quite surprised. Like they use data just to gather the metrics, but they couldn't use it to actually create pieces of content.
Yep. Yeah, no, that's great. That's exactly what we see, right? People are data-driven for some aspects. They're really data-driven for fine-tuning the channel and the audience, but then to actually create the image that people will see, no one cares. And it's the biggest contributor. So we haven't looked at fitness specifically. I don't think we have a client that, actually, well, no, this is not fitness. We recently onboarded Booty, which is kind of a brand that is getting well known in the realm of, I think, sportswear. I'm not exactly sure, but no, we haven't done anything specifically for fitness. It can definitely be very impactful. And in the realm of fitness, I know there's a lot of kind of lifestyle advertisement that is really strong. And in that dimension, you don't want to like necessarily showcase a product that people will click. You want to showcase, your brand and make people go to your gym or use your products more. And in that sense, yeah, so being able to predict whether you're going to be seen and remembered is extremely important. We're trying to show people that it's important. Yeah. So if you have, absolutely, if you have some ads out there, happy to give you a demo.
When it comes to any sports organization, like teams and things like that.
Esports organization. Oh, that would be so cool. No, we haven't done anything with esports organizations yet, but I would love to do that. Yeah.
My question for you is, so my advertising, I don't really have a call to action. Don't really perform as good as things that do have a call to action.
Yep.
Some values to my clients. So I was wondering, I'm not sure if you specialize in this, but what are some call to actions that you see that are the most effective and I guess keep people engaged coming back to the learning?
That's a good question. I don't have a good answer for you because it really depends on your vertical, your context, your audience, lots of different things. What I can tell you is that if you plug in your historic data into our platform, we'll be able to tell you what CTR version and position and placement will be better for you. Now, what the concept that you did bring, though, that having a CTA is better than not having one. Yeah, we definitely see that pattern too. Specifically for engaging, for getting more clicks, right? If you have a call to action, yeah, your CTR improves necessarily. But what's also very interesting is that the shape the position and how much attention share it gets in the image also impact quite heavily your ultimate CTR and CPC. So yeah, something to fine tune as well.
So on that, I have another question. So obviously, like you guys said, sex and car crashes. So you're trying to do like a huge brand, like, I don't know, like it's something as big or gonna be like Apple-wise, like obviously Apple can't do stuff like that. So for, I guess, a brand like that, what can they sort of do, for example, starting up, that's not really, I guess, something about to kind of grow themselves.
Oh, tons and tons of things. Yeah. Again, so those patterns are kind of general patterns that are generally true. But as I said, there are so many ways of fine-tuning small things to reach that memorability peak or attention in context peak or CTR peak that don't necessarily force you to put a face or to put someone, without clothes in your. So there are many, many different ways to achieve that effect. And what big brands do mostly is they have general concepts, they plug in different versions of the concepts, and they can immediately see what version performs better than others. So Hellman's will plug in those two assets and will tell you this one is very expensive, this one works better. And that just giving the ability for big brands to do that kind of pre-test without going into A/B test saves them tons of money because the amount that they spend on A/B tests is ridiculous. So that's kind of a very big part. And then another big part of our platform is the ability to gather insights from your historic data. And that's also very useful for these big brands like potentially your Apple to know kind of what worked well and what to apply in the future. And so we'll surface things like, hey, look, when you put the Apple logo at the end with a white background, it gets a ton of share of attention, and that generally gets you better CTR. Or when you, do the switch between scene 1 and scene 2, it's much, much better than doing scene 2 than scene 1.
So I guess there's like a certain risk analysis involved too, because depending on what the brand's goals are and where they are as it relates to their maturation, they could go after some of those more shocking types of campaigns. Think about 20, 30 years ago, that iconic Apple commercial, you might not have seen it, that George Orwell-esque commercial. I would encourage everybody to take a look at it. It was pretty amazing. I mean, it was remarkable, and it put Apple on everybody's radar instantly. So take a look at that.
Thank you for coming.
Thank you.
Anyone else? All right. Well, yep, let's thank Camilo, everyone, for joining us today. Thank you so much. Really amazing. And let's take a 5-10 minute break. All right.
Yeah, those were some really powerful sessions. You have to go a little bit into the realm of sound and music. Those are some really cool.
Let's say you are marketing for something. Any number of doing more color. So that we try to change the shades. But when you start a school, when you also start, when somebody else starts a school, anything for their class, maybe over everything. Yeah, but
there's definitely a space for brands for doing
Because they already have big
Yeah.
at the same time they were doing this.
There's also some so they're very interesting to manage. And so right now, that's not that much.
Then which target audience? What's the main target audience? First. So like for the top,
although we don't see brands using wildlife, it's super useful to test. Now, when I said this, well, right, what if I move plants? What if it's weird?
So yeah, it's all about generating content. First thing.
Exacto.
Nada, no, de verdad, súper, súper interesante. No, sabía. Antes y sobre todo. Social media, digamos. Sí,
Sí, eso se da un montón. Y la forma en la cual decidí empezar a utilizar era porque le llegaba el profesor, lo llegaba 2 minutos y decía, ¿qué es esto? Sí, o que tenía una spreadsheet de las opciones y la gente iba diciendo comentarios de y por supuesto todavía me quedé un poco de y te digan, no, mira, la teoría no es cierto. La teoría no es dos insights. Pero sí, la gente se puede hacer. Podemos hacer. Sí, sí, creo que entonces, más de deportes encantado de colaborar.
Ya te digo, como te he presentado, es un campo también a nivel de NYU, la universidad, se pone en educación integrada. Sí, es un máster cambiando. Y
encantaría estar produciendo contenido de forma constante. Si algo que seguro separado son todas especiales, mira otra gente, awareness, es un mundo en el cual nos vamos a meter. Sí, algo así.
Si le echo una foto, así que si el segundo, ya te digo, no sé.
Yeah, I think the Word document is probably easier. Yeah. It's mid-journey images. That's interesting. We actually. Yeah.
Sí, yo voy a sigo pero bueno, con lo cual que eso ya lo más sería
Sí.
luego como me quedo sin luego así
That's super bueno. Creo que hay muchas cosas cool más. No sé si eso. Hoy en día se puede hacer dicho es hacer reflexión, tu ciudad en el trabajo, y eso es toda la necesidad. Parte, después te lo voy a poner.
en parte de la idea que te digo, si sigue bueno, formas de poder contenido ahí, la idea High stakes data.